Welcome. My name is Achim Koeddermann from the Philosophy Department at SUNY Oneonta, State University of New York at Oneonta, and I have the great pleasure today to introduce to you an emeritus faculty member from our faculty who will speak to us about Mont Blanc. We have heard about Mont Blanc in my classes for a long time, and I want to make this available for a bigger audience. Professor Moynihan, would you please introduce yourself?
Yes. I haven't changed my name. Robert Moynihan is the name. And I taught here until 2000 and came here from the University of Arizona. How I got involved in Romantic literature is through an NEH seminar with Harold Bloom. I heard him speak at the English Institute at Columbia University. One of my dear friends here, Donald Peterson, invited me to accompany him there, and I then applied for an NEH fellowship at Yale and studied with Bloom there, and was the only person in his history to have interrupted him during a lecture. And I can be interrupted at any moment that Professor Koeddermann chooses. And that is how I got involved in the interest in the English Romantics. Then I had an NEH with Professor Hartman at Yale, and I dedicate this paper to him. He's extremely ill, and as happens to everyone, he's afflicted with age. And so that's the general introduction. My dissertation was on the 18th century novel, so nothing could be further from Richardson's Clarissa than this presentation. And it is, believe me, a great relief to be able to talk about this great poem. Thank you.
So let's move to the next part of our presentation, in which I would like you to actually give us an interpretation, and we'll conclude the interpretation by a reading of the poem by Shelley.
Mont Blanc by Percy Bysshe Shelley. Shelley was only 25 years old when he wrote this magnificent work, and it followed a tour that he made to the highest peak in the Alps. And I will refer to that as we go along in the paper. A simple title, Mont Blanc, that should immediately arouse investigation, but most titles do not, whatever their arresting, provocative, or presumptive associations. Any name should arouse curiosity. Any white mountain must conceal several levels of meaning, for mountains do not remain singularly white, even under snow or ice, yet the act of naming presumes control without investigation. It is a pre-existing, then imposed simplicity. The promise of language for subtlety, recorded levels for multidimensions, is thereby aborted. For multidimensional is reduced to a single quick level. This oversimplification is the most observable common use of terminology, alas. White mountain, therefore, the translation of this work, is dismissed with but a semi-second flicker, perhaps a notice on a map, or an innocent invocation by a tourist. The term that might be used for superficial recognition as a verb. I touristed Aosta in northern Italy and learned their term for meat sauce. Well, but the visitor wouldn't mention exactly where the sauce was prepared, how to do it, or what other riches lie outside the general gustatory limitations of the average person. The common tourist observes but does not recognize, is guided but has little curiosity, and too frequently does not read about any city or site before visiting it. At least in a title, Shelley, in Mont Blanc, we have an illusion of the definite, a source, however slight, of nominal information. Actually, though, titles alone contain minimal pre-information. Two tendencies, however, create confusions of interpreting. One, the Procrustean, fitting meaning into an already formal pattern, a primal step above the simplified, still basic reaction to language and naming, but still a gross distortion. The academic critic Earl Wasserman, for instance, places Shelley in the tradition of piety, of seeing realities as a path to generalized infinities, exactly what Shelley questions and forcefully denies in this great work of close observation. It is not, in another critical elaboration, any form of religion, no matter how defined, as in this statement drawn from a morass of commentary, a close-packed assertion of the Shelleyan variety of religion that I have been expounding. Perhaps that should have been accompanied with a gesture. Or even a first-hand account of personal religious experience, or an experience centered in the composition of poetry. That also is a quote. It is not, however, religious in any accepted sense. Even Kenneth Neil Cameron, a great editor of Shelley, succumbs to aureate fancy in Shelley, The Golden Years, Harvard, 1974, forsaking his earlier skepticism, muddling into references such as a larger power, and the evasion of observation in the work arises from generality. Images have come from creative power, he says. Whatever reservations one may have about fluorescent religious categories in Harold Bloom's first book, Shelley's Myth-Making, that work could hypothetically be something of an improvement over other critics cited. However, with Shelley's great poem, the uses of religion in any degree are suspect, for he maintained that the majority of religious comment acts and reacts in a cycle with very little or even without evidence. Any attempts to question symbols of credulity, such as the appearance of the divine in whirlwinds or fire, turn back upon themselves and result in tautologies such as I am who am. The maker of such statements then disappears, but is invested with created meanings and elaborations which turn from themselves in ever-widening and more circular evasions. Skeptics like Thomas Paine, in his 1802 prospect papers, The God of Truth is Not the God of Fable, might hold that nothing could be more indicative of the procedures than the risen Christ, who again shows himself to the disciples and reappears for Thomas's naive investigation in the Gospel of John. This is an account not in the other three evangelists, none of whose versions happen to agree in every confirming detail. As declared to Thomas in this Gospel of John, because thou hast seen me, thou hast believed. Blessed are they that have not seen and yet have believed. Paine and the Rights of Man, however, questioned the cooperative links between established state-supported religion and the regal, or the British system. Civil distinctions can be founded only on public utility. Contrary to their histories, differing sects should not torment and render each other miserable. As for the non-existent British Constitution, not a document but a series of political and religious traditions, it has been taken for granted to be good, and encomiums have supplied the place of proof. Religion itself in that arrangement is very improperly made a political machine. As for the nature of control, of all the tyrannies that afflict mankind, tyranny in religion is the worst. Every other species of tyranny is limited to the world we live in, but the attempts to stride beyond the grave in religion seeks to pursue us into eternity. That's, of course, with damnation. Kenneth Neal Cameron and Newman Ivy White provide one of several essential clues for interpreting this great poem. One was Shelley's own intense skepticism. Another, his early infatuation with scientific discovery. As a rebellious student in boarding school, he concocted gunpowder, put it in his classroom desk, and blew it up. Though a reader of Greek and Latin literature, a translator of Plato's Ion, he was aware of contemporary scientific investigations about the age of the earth and its geological changes, whether from fire or earthquake, all of which denied the earth is formed according to Bishop James Ussher's infamous 1650-1654 chronology, which set the creation at 4004 BC. Each animal could be accurately named and classified in English, at least according to the benign accounts of creation in the Bible and the fourth book of John Milton's Paradise Lost. Ussher himself was born in Dublin and whiled away the long Irish winters by counting the ages given the Jewish progenitors, including Methuselah's 969 years. This is a figure still counted as a 5th century BC creation in total. America's more provincial but affluent outposts, thanks to national government subsidies, and a great battle is waged over control of school boards and texts in states of the Chigger Belt and the far south, something of an Alamo of scientific finding defeated by creationism, the flight into pseudo-literature rising to pathological fantasy in its zanier outreaches, such as Texas. Shelley is a youth, according to Cameron and White in their citation of the memoir by Thomas Jefferson Hogg, his roommate and close friend and co-troublemaker, not merely exploded his desk, but played a game with country curates and Anglican divines. To paraphrase, I am a simple youth inquiring after both truth and belief. Help me, please. Shelley might then quote lines from the Testaments asking for clarification. The curates, having sought to establish certain truth, might turn to Ussher's infamous commentary, Annals of the Old and New Testament, for guidance, or some other evasion, and Shelley would begin a cross-examination into the inconsistent language of miraculous occurrences and biblical narratives. This, I take it, is the essential structure of his great poem. Shelley very consciously plays with the terms of higher evasion, or generalities, so common with their necessary prerequisites for religious expostulation and sermonizing. The stance before multiple phenomena of nature, particularly mountains, has been the occasion for, as the evangelist John could have put it, the world itself cannot contain all the bad poetry written about them. The majority of this subgenre should have been based on evasion of the sensible, as in evidence from the senses, from sensory experience, from observation. Even when visiting the Alps became an activity of English tourists. Shelley himself visited alpine sites where English visitors came to experience the platitudinous varieties of awe or of God's handiwork, and spiritual inspiration, redundancy, obviously, they recorded. Shelley in Greek inscribed and signed his name at more than one site with variations, I am an atheist. We must remember that he and his friend, Thomas Jefferson Hogg, were expelled for the 1811 undergraduate pamphlet, The Necessity of Atheism, noted by literate deans and other academic functionaries, or those who could at least read titles. After its discovery, the bookstore burned all of its copies. Shelley had placed them there himself. The argument was not original. It echoed David Hume's essay on miracles, but they were enough in Hume's own 18th century life, ending in 1776, to deny him university professorships. The Shelley-Hogg pamphlet, however, maintains that It is easier to suppose that the universe has existed from all eternity than to conceive a being capable of creating it. Shelley had written his father 3 days before placing the necessity, and he described a creature that would be metaphorically, even essentially altered in the 1817 poem. Supposing 12 men were to make an affidavit before you that they had seen a snake in Africa 12 miles long. We cannot believe facts inconsistent with the general laws of nature and of observation. Hogg and Shelley both refused to say if they were responsible. They were expelled. Shelley complained to everyone. The father did not know what to think. He was a Whig member of Parliament, knighted, wealthy, and in the custom of that day and this, those who paid the academic piper expected tunes of ready social acceptance, not jarring, dissonant rejection of a first son. Sir Timothy repulsed this Hogg, who later became a Tory and a notorious snob. He didn't like his name, and he withdrew the invitation to the Great House. Let aside, however, some of the verse written by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who died in 1824, from the bottom drawer of his inspiration, the hymn before sunrise. This is typical of a bad poem about mountains. It has an odd debt to the 17th century Spanish extremities of Góngora. A favorite line is, "Woods periwigged with snow," or the young John Dryden writing of mortal smallpox, "Each little tear hath a pimple in it." Here is Coleridge. "Hast thou a charm to say, the morning star in his steep course? So long he seems to pause on thy bald, awful head, O sovereign Blanc." Where does this alopecia or baldness lead? To the divine, or divine as is pronounced in our southern precincts. Thou too again, stupendous mountain, thou that as I raise my head while bowed low in adoration upward from thy base, slow traveling with dim eyes suffused with tears, solemnly seems like a vapory cloud to rise before me. Rise, oh, ever rise. Rise, yes, there are 3 of them. Rise like a cloud of incense from the earth, thou kingly spirit throned among the hills, thou dread ambassador from earth to heaven, great hierarch. Tell thou the silent sky, and tell the stars, and tell yon rising sun, earth with her 1,000 voices praises God, all in capital letters, G-O-D. Examine the terms of conventional religious piety in these lines. Hierarch is a religious leader, an authority, and spirit and cloud of incense are unavoidable tokens of belief, but another element in the placing, the imposition of natural phenomena as a prop for royalty. And now unnatural, though then natural in the sense of commonly accepted reference to political dominance and subservience. Kingly spirit throned among the hills. One should not cavil. However, the sun does not rise for the benefit of a stable Ptolemaic earth, though the common phrase preserves its subsisting fallacy. Contradicting the reactionary politics of these lines, Shelley repeatedly denied the subservience and its prop, conventional belief, and overt rejection in his 1819 song to the men of England. I quote this entirely in the paper. I'll make it brief. Men of England, wherefore plough for the lords who lay ye low? Wherefore weave with toil and care the rich robes your tyrants wear? The seed ye sow, another reaps. The wealth ye find, another keeps. The robes ye weave, another wears. The arms ye forge, another bears. However, let us now turn to the lines of the major work itself in question. The divulging white mountain and its contradictory techniques of representation. It begins simply with a massive, though generally unrecognized, paradox. The everlasting universe of things. Things? Though joined with everlasting universe, that term itself is contrary to the assertive evidence of the mountain, a thing or object viewed closely with its changing, violent landscape. If there is apparent quiet or natural repose, both are impermanent, both are illusory, both viewed from a distance. The tributary of a feeble brook shall change to a violent river. It's a matter of perspective. One should notice the opening verbs of change, so potent and insistent. The everlasting universe of things flows through the mind and rolls its rapid waves, now dark, now glittering, now reflecting gloom, now lending splendor. Where from secret springs the source of human thought its tribute brings of water, with a sound but half its own, such as a feeble brook will oft assume in the wild woods among the mountains lone, where waterfalls around it leap forever, where woods and winds contend and a vast river over its rocks ceaselessly bursts and raves. In these 11 lines, the verbs contradict any imposed stasis, so familiar in pious generalities. Observation should instead be about the dynamic flows, rolls, glittering, reflecting, lending, brings, assume, leap, contend, bursts, and raves. The line should be seen as an epistemology of multiple experiences opposing the merely nominal, the nouns, the apparently static. The passage moves to rocks, which themselves will be subjected to alpine ice and winds. Even the emphatic violence of revolution, climactically charged. I'll reread that, emphasizing those verbs. The everlasting universe of things flows through the mind and rolls its rapid waves, now dark, now glittering, now reflecting gloom, now lending splendor, where from secret springs the source of human thought its tribute brings of water with a sound but half its own, etc. The emotion of the passage, its disruption, bursts and raves, is a reason for general critical avoidance. Pedestrian commentary is charged, though, with social conformity, evasion, references to antecedents, the sacred past. As criticism retreats into the recesses of academe, it speaks less and less to contingency, to the pressing needs and abuses of and by society. The masks of common belief often conceal a moderating generality, evasions, social posturing. One must not, in the T.S. Eliot phrase, insult the donors or taxpayers or even mankind with too much reality. Too much reality, however, is precisely Shelley's overt strategy, incongruously pairing terms of piety and blunt observation. Facticity opposes evasion and contradictory generalities with their subsidiary and unthinking associations. Observation refutes terms of exhortation found in the pathetic lines of Coleridge, whose lowercase poetic attempts to reach the sublime, yet falls into banality and overstatement with nakedly contradictory assertions. Coleridge assumes the generally accepted, even with that bald-headed mountain summit. It should inevitably lead, through predisposed reader believers, to an insistent, though embarrassing and unsupported uppercase divinity, God. The contrast is between the empirical, or what can be proved with accurate evidence, and its abiding evasions. In Shelley's work, the struggle lives with the reality opposing two expected and therefore unexamined epithets. What are some of these? Everlasting universe, many-voiced power, elder time, devotion, old and solemn harmony, ethereal, deep eternity, sublime, clear universe, wandering wings, ghosts, omnipotence, soul infinite, serene, seems eternal, seems perpetual, destined. A brief sermon could even be improvised from this very vocabulary. We are congregated and we are here to bear witness to the everlasting universe and to honor that many-voiced power that comes from the devotion of an elder time, that old and solemn harmony of the ethereal, that deep eternity some have called sublime, but it comes to us from the clear universe, the wandering wings of omnipotence, from the spirits, through them, or holy ghosts of belief. Omnipotence grants our souls glimpses of the infinite and serene. It indeed is so strong within us that it embraces the eternal. It is indeed perpetual, even destined, and truly everlasting. Please remember the building fund in your weekly donations. Conventional piety accompanies descriptions of nature. St. Augustine's 5th century autobiography, the Confessions, with its italicized emphasis, is typical. We see the firmament of heaven, whether that primary body of the world, between the spiritual upper waters and the inferior corporeal waters, or since this is also called heaven, the space of air through which wander the fowls of heaven. We behold a face of waters gathered together in the fields of the sea, and the dry land, both void and formed so as to be visible and harmonized, yea, and the matter of herbs and trees. We behold the face of the earth. Milton's general ancestor, Adam, enunciates the splendors of order to creation in the 4th book of Paradise Lost. Millions of spiritual creatures walk the earth unseen, both when we wake and when we sleep. All these with ceaseless praise his works behold, both day and night. How often from the steep of echoing hill or thicket have we heard celestial voices to the midnight air, soul or responsive each to other's note, singing their great Creator. I hope that the magnificence of that stands in contrast to Coleridge. Milton's other references to these terms occur in his major works, such as the 4th book of Paradise Lost. The fallen angel complains, "Oh, had his powerful destiny ordained me some inferior angel, I had stood then happy." Destiny, then, is not merely fatal. It's fixed in the supernatural by divine preordination. These are terms, of course, that Shelley uses. Eternal, as the inference in Milton of the divine being without beginning or end. And it even has a Miltonic reference to wings, which Shelley will incorporate. O Spirit, instruct me, for thou knowest, thou from the first was present, and with mighty wings outspread dove-like, satst brooding on the vast abyss and madest it pregnant. What in me is dark, illumine. What is low, raise and support, that to the height of this great argument I may assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men. With the commotion of the celestial, of the ethereal, Milton's Adam bids a divine messenger farewell. Go, heavenly guest, ethereal messenger, sent from whose sovereign goodness I adore. Sublime emerges in the dark portrait of the fallen, essentially altered angels, again with recurrence and essential reversals by Shelley. They all him followed, issuing forth to the open field, where all yet left of that revolted rout, heaven fallen in station stood, or just array, sublime with expectation, when to see in triumph issuing forth their glorious chief, they saw but other sight instead, a crowd of ugly serpents. Sublime is limited in this quasi-religious meaning, perfection, by Bishop Burnet in his History of His Own Time, 1724. He was a most sublime Christian. What realistic terms do these potentially holy words modify? Those related from awesome to perpetual, from devotion to serene, the others cited above. The nominal, the nouns signifying things, and their mutability, their consistent changes. The terms are abundant. Things, waves, springs, waters, brook, woods, mountain, waterfalls, winds, river, rocks. Those appear in the first lines. The third section of the poem may celebrate the appearances of the remoter world, as Mont Blanc appears, line 61, in the distance, with the possibility that faith shall arise in an abstraction from this scene, still snowy and serene. The multiply nominal, however, things overwhelm any potential evasions, the gleams of a remoter world, beginning with the possibly evasive terms dream and cloud. But the terms then listed are unavoidably set in changing nature to be observed in turmoil. Mountains, ice and rock, vales, floods, deep steeps, desert storms, eagle, home, wolf, sea of fire, voice, mountain, codes. To return to the beginning, Mont Blanc, the reader sees that the contest between action and passivity, verb and noun, already noted, is capable of re-emphasis. In the first 11 lines, the verbal forms are flows, rolls, glittering, reflecting, lending, brings, assume, leap, contend, bursts, and raves. The conclusion of the first lines, with repeated rough R's, leaves in doubt the continued resistance, the only apparently unchanging rocks. A vast river over its rocks ceaselessly bursts and raves. One perhaps does not wish to accept the working of euphony and cacophony, pleasant and rough sounds, but the repeated R, river, rocks, bursts, raves, is antiphonal to its preceding and repeated W's and liquid L's. An intensely poetic, though too easily ignored representation of antithesis, opposition. To partially repeat, in the wild woods, among the mountains lone, where waterfalls around it leap forever, where woods and winds contend, and a vast river over its rocks ceaselessly bursts and raves. The poem is a representation of dynamic volution, with a description of nature based on analysis, paired with misleading generalities, it rising to systemic declaratives, the revolutionary remaking of perception about the nominal things cited earlier with words of change. Note that the evolution is between vague first appearances, like a tourist, perhaps based in already cited dreams, clouds, vapors. We should also note that these first impressions resolve into violence in a more closely observed scene, which shall be revisited, one of the most climactic in any literature, and a triumph of close perspective. Thou hast a voice, great mountain, to repeal large codes of fraud and woe. Not understood by all, but which the wise and great and good interpret or make felt or deeply feel. The epistemology of these lines, or how we know what we know, covers both internal and external knowledge. And the poem discusses the methods of knowing, but they all depend on overwhelming evidence of the natural scene, which can then be interpreted as didacticism or even intense subjectivity, deeply feel. This early statement, however, is contradicted, as is the idea of mountains ranged in superiority and subservience, invoked earlier, but denied as forms of human analogy, human comparison. Far, far above, piercing the infinite sky, Mont Blanc appears, still snowy and serene. Its subject mountains, their unearthly forms, pile around it. This is not, though, a religio-social hierarchy. It is immediately subjected to the realities of the dynamic of unpredictable change. Ice and rock, broad veils between of frozen floods, unfathomable deeps, blue as the overhanging heaven that spread and whined among the accumulated steeps, a desert peopled by the storms alone, save where the eagle brings some hunter's bone, and the wolf tracks her there, how hideously its shapes are heaped around. Rude, bare, and high, ghastly, scarred, and riven. Is this the scene where the old earthquake demon taught her young ruin? In his long 1816 letter from Chamonix describing the scene, Shelley interrupts the description of rare alpine plants to observe, "Did I tell you there are troops of wolves among these mountains? In the winter, they descend into the valleys, which the snow occupies during 6 months of the year, and devour everything they find outside of the doors. A wolf's more powerful than the fiercest and strongest dog." Demon, like other references, could be a misleading term. Is it merely, as one anthology note defines it, personification of geologic forces? Yes, but it's also a remnant of different worlds of meaning, one held in the memories of those with classical learning, of texts taught in Latin and Greek literatures and in both their original languages. Another is more immediate reference to a source quite close to Shelley's reading of nearly contemporary English descent. Demon, at merely one level of meaning, was brutally appropriated for literal purposes in Christian writing as a synonym for devil. In classical literatures, however, demon carried the much more benign significance of a power that is strange, uncanny, or even a denoted intermediate existence between the known and the unknown. This is one level of meaning in Shelley's use of the term. However, the other more immediate meaning that Shelley himself would have known is close to his reading in English. Shelley overtly rescues mountains from both misspent ejaculations of belief and the customary flights into classical mythology with this reference from the first pages of Thomas Paine's The Age of Reason. After giving Satan this triumph over the whole creation, one would have supposed that the church mythologists would have been kind enough to send him back again to the pit. Or if they had not done this, that they should have put a mountain upon him, that is, the devil. For they say that faith can remove a mountain, and they should put him under a mountain. With intense irony, verging on sarcasm, Shelley, in effect, does put a mountain upon past beliefs, while invoking again misleading language. Not merely that of personification, but divination, the interpretation of natural phenomena as a forecast of the future. I have a bunch of quotations here from the Bible. I will give you the passages, the citations, not the passages. Genesis 40 and 41, 2 Kings 2, 11, 14, Chronicles 33, 6, Proverbs 16, 33, Hosea 8, 7. And the last, the irreverent have sown the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind. It hath no stalk, the bud shall yield no meal. You can see that that metaphor is completely inverted and turned around by Shelley and another radical text. Milton again hovers over Shelley's inversion of sacred reverence, or to phrase it Miltonically, over Shelley's inversions of sacred reference. Milton again hovers, but with a mountain top invisible. Forthwith from all the ends of heaven appeared under their hierarchs in orders bright 10,000 ensigns, high advanced, standards twixt van and rear stream in the air, and for distinction serve of hierarchies or orders and degrees, or in their glittering tissues bear emblazoned holy memorials, acts of zeal and love recorded eminent. Thus, when in orbs of circuit inexpressible they stood, orb within orb, the Father infinite, by whom in bliss embosomed sat the Son, amidst as from a flaming mount, whose top brightness had made invisible. All of these meanings, the classical, the biblical, the more recent imposition by descendant church mythologists with their belief, would have been part of Shelley's cultural vocabulary. The scene of change and ruin, however, cannot be subsumed in generalized faith, even with its customs and evasive generalizations. The context of Shelley's own lines, where there are multiple levels of meaning, is altered with many senses of the term. Removing mountains, indeed, is part of the geological process Shelley describes, and on an emphatically natural level. Should interpretation, however, be found and bound only by and to serious references? Shelley was known as a prankster, but he's lost that persona in overly serious commentary. The meanings listed above are certainly present as antecedents. All terms carry the baggage of association. Each word has an individual history, and some meanings are quite distant from each other. That is the case for which. Indeed, it may be a playful analogy for the streams and other water references in the work. Samuel Johnson's second definition in his 1755 dictionary is a winding, sinuous bank, a reference to the scene Shelley describes with its sites of natural turmoil. In other words, which, in that sense, is an arresting prank, though it also carries the connotations of other harridans and more conventional agents of the supernatural. The mind then receives impressions at multiple levels of perception. They are internalized in reaction and memory. But events themselves are unmistakably separate, subject to the inevitable rules of change. Again, the vocabulary of piety has been inserted, but is contradicted with a volatile recall of past perceptions and the dynamic, that phantom, that image of memory as subject is secondary to immediate perception. Thou art there, line 28. What is thou? All the phenomena of experience, the recorded memory of the mountain, even when retained and changed by the witch poesy, the dialectical and wicked substitute for the muse, so habitual a reference in conventional apostrophe, the address to an abstraction as though present. The traditional invocation of Calliope, the muse of epic, is consistent from the opening of Homer's pagan Odyssey, Tell Me Muse, to a reformed Christian invocation by John Milton in the 6th line of Paradise Lost, Sing Heavenly Muse. However, both demon and witch are reformed and invoked by Shelley. They both allow the creative, though reliant act of making in and through experience, even from sources of memory. It arises, or more accurately, they arise from seem. For the dizzy ravine, even with its potential vertigo, its dizziness, is the basis of first things, the perception of phenomena, events too dominant to ignore, commotion, loud, ceaseless, unresting. Thy caverns echoing to the Arve's commotion, a loud, lone sound no other sound can tame. Thou art pervaded with that ceaseless motion. Thou art the path of that unresting sound, dizzy ravine. The strategy of the poem, already inferred, enters the techniques of debate, definition, rebuttal, surrebuttal, conclusion. The holding of perception in both act and memory is unavoidable, even with a passive attention, even one that follows the conditional seem, but resolving in the repetition of clear universe of things. I seem as in a trance, sublime and strange, to muse on my own separate fantasy, my human mind, which passively now renders and receives fast influencings, holding an unremitting interchange with the clear universe of things around. Despite wandering wings, in the next line, however, are things potentially innate impressions. They are held in memory and even described as ghosts, line 46, an archaic term for spirits. So should they, internalized, be dominant? No, for all rest on sensory record. In one of the major turns of the poem, earlier lines were considered as a potential rebuttal of Platonic idealism and the fusion of Christian theories of eternity, where ideas could be described as innate and relatively unchanging. These lines, describing thought without prior experience, have already been countered. Some say. That phrase is itself casually dismissive of this accepted message or potential rebuttal that has been reduced to fantasy, dream state, with its opposite, living perception. Some say that gleams of a remoter world visit the soul in sleep, that death is slumber, and that its shapes the busy thoughts outnumber of those who wake and live. Perception, however, of what? The reality, brutally described, is of the overwhelming alpine scene, the mountain itself and its dominant glacier rising like a wall before a viewer. Mont Blanc appears. But is it still snowy and serene? This is the Shelley of youthful strategy, the mask of possible surrender to founded, established belief, the pretense of writing credulous believers and their religious agents for explanations, all in the poet's mind invalid and open to contradiction? Or is the answer in origins predating accurate human record? Two theories, what a later poet, the American Robert Frost, called fire and ice, are possible, though neither in Shelley is from the hand of an omnipotent creator. The supposed dominance of the scene is overwhelmed. There may be subordinate mountains, but they are natural formations and dangerously subject to natural forces to be described later. Mont Blanc appears still snowy and serene. Its subject mountains, their unearthly forms pile around it, ice and rock, broad veils between of frozen floods, unfathomable deeps. The passage is too easily dismissed. What does it not say? There is no support for the customary lapse into pathetic fallacy, describing natural phenomena with human attributes. Yet the phenomena do speak later. The bald head of the mountain that talks, which we've seen earlier in a severe poetic lapse. There is as yet no response from a speaking mountain. Only the natural scene of discord and contradiction directed against suspected generalities. The ironic play with speaking phenomena is one of the heightened games of Shelley's poem. A strategic debating gambit, one approaching preterition, is the tactic of denying an assertion while simultaneously placing it in circulation. None can reply, all seems eternal now. Yet there shall be replies, and those highly altered from his customary personified speaking mountain. Again, there's the introduction of contradictory modifiers, of epithets that do not fit suspected automatic associations. The wilderness has a mysterious tongue which teaches awful doubt, or faith so mild, so solemn, so serene, that man may be, but for such a faith with nature reconciled. Thou hast a voice, great mountain, to repeal large codes of fraud and woe. The yoking together of seems eternal, mysterious tongue, awful doubt, faith so mild, are unconventional if not contradictory, for awe inspires belief. Eternity has no seams or limits of time, and expressions of the voice should not be mysterious, but elucidating, explaining, giving meaning. This voice, nonetheless, is not that of dogma, for the awful doubt is meant to overwhelm faith so mild. The phrases are euphonious, joined by the easy use of repetition, so and so easily uttered, that they may seem acceptable, so solemn, so serene. Repetition at the beginning of phrases, or anaphora, is the cheapest and most readily available rhetorical technique, and this so should be taken as its opposite, not an intensive, but an item of suspicion. But in the next line should be emphasized a negation, and a line break should occur before the assertive voice of evidence, not merely a personified natural scene, invoked to refute human error. Faith so mild, so solemn, so serene, that man may be, but for such faith with nature reconciled. Thou hast a voice, great mountain, to repeal large codes of fraud and woe. Yes, but as asserted later in the work, even silently. Lines 135, 136. For the works of nature are universal. That is, works, not a static generalization. The paradox of the silent voice is that of pre-existing, though declarative evidence before a viewer. Preceding these lines just cited, Shelley hammers evidence against supine, passive acceptance, setting the adverting mind, one turning its attention to phenomena, against general torpor and the mythologies of dull acceptance. The term daedal is related to Daedalus, the maker, not of simple monoliths, but repeated intricacies of multiple creation, an analogy for perceptions of multiple evidence. One of the lines shall become figures of potential, nearly actual change, described later in Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, indicated here with italics, which I'll try to emphasize. The fields, the lakes, the forests, and the streams, ocean, and all the living things that dwell within the daedal earth, lightning and rain, earthquake and fiery flood and hurricane, the torpor of the year when feeble dreams visit the hidden buds, or dreamless sleep holds every future leaf and flower, the bound with which from that detested trance they leap, the works and ways of man, their death and birth, and that of him and all that he may be, all things that move and breathe with toil and sound, are born and die, revolve, subside, and swell. Power dwells apart in its tranquility, remote, serene, and inaccessible. Power, of course, is an abstract word. And this, the naked countenance of earth, on which I gaze, even these primeval mountains, teach the adverting mind. I had to repeat that. The origin, the primeval, the first time are hidden without human record. With closer perspective, however, they reveal the working of multiple changes, even once again with the muted and now limited distraction of potential, though heavily discounted and even denied, piety, mortal power, perpetual, destined, reclaimed, retreat, joy, majestic, all with somewhat religious associations. Shelley then pivots, turning attention to the serpentine record of debris on the face of the glacier, far from the casual associations of the tempting snake, a demonic metamorphosis in the book of Genesis, and its adaptation in Milton, the tempter's speech, as when of some orator renowned in Athens or free Rome, where eloquence flourished, since mute in some great cause addressed. This natural gravel, this debris in ice, is the record of percolation. As the glacier, only apparently stable from a distance, actually moves and slowly gathers particles of earth to its surface. This pattern is undulant, is curvilinear, resembling the Serpentine. Anyone can visit this site, make a non-religious pilgrimage to the Aosta Valley in the village of Chamonix. The experience should confirm Shelley's description, which is both realistic and poetic. The glaciers creep like snakes that watch their prey from their far fountains slow rolling on. As conventional analogies are destroyed, nothing is stable or sacred. There many a precipice, frost and the sun in scorn of mortal power have piled, dome, pyramid, and pinnacle, a city of death, distinct with many a tower and wall impregnable of beaming ice, yet not a city, but a flood of ruin is there that from the boundaries of the sky rolls its perpetual stream. Vast pines are strewing its destined path, or on the mangled soil branchless and shattered stand. The rocks drawn down from yon remotest waste have overthrown the limits of the dead and living world, never to be reclaimed. What are the terms here? Waters, line 6, rainbows, waterfall, frozen floods, lakes, streams, ocean, flood of ruin, rushing torrents, river, loud waves, ocean waves. All from line 6 to 125. The poet, however, the maker of lists in a memorable utterance, is an alchemist of memorable meaning. The race of man flies far in dread. His work and dwelling vanish like smoke before the tempest stream, and their place is not known. Below, vast caves shine in the rushing torrent's restless gleam, which from those secret chasms in tumult will meet in the vale, and one majestic river, the breath and blood of distant lands, forever rolls its loud waters to the ocean waves, breathes its swift vapors to the circling air. Victorian social and art critic John Ruskin imagined a flight over the Alps. He described a view as a bird in flight, a creature gifted with sight and the power of description. He must have come to this fellow genius of heightened verbal ability, Shelley, who in this great poem veers closely to the danger of the pathetic fallacy, which Ruskin first defined, emphasizing its inanity. All those speaking inanimate objects of weak verse, such as the spendthrift crocus bursting through the mold, naked and shivering with his cup of gold, or the one red leaf, the last of its clan, that dances as often as dance it can. Notice how Shelley avoids sing-song, which is certainly explicit in those lines. However, observed objects do, in a manner, enter a special realm, or as Vladimir Nabokov described it in his autobiographical title, Speak, Memory. Remembered observations do speak, though are subject to multiple distortions, also well documented in extensive court dockets and elusive psychoanalytic records. The memories of Shelley's work, however, are viewed from numerous and multiple perspectives, with frequent discounts of and opposition to multiple errors of subjective assertion, which his work forcefully intends to displace. Nature, then, speaks most notably through its observed and unavoidable realities viewed from different perspectives and repeated examinations, even when held in memory. That is the epistemological canvas of this poem. Experience, then experience held in memory, then the realization at another level of unequaled natural description brought to the prospect of human improvement through heightened written observation. It indeed is a power, yet cannot be solely innate, is not formulated from authority, should not be filtered through ignorant preconception. It is, as stated, the secret strength of things, rolling through perspectives of apprehension that should provide the means of human sight, of realistic change possible before every informing and informed viewer. The conclusion. Mont Blanc yet gleams on high. The power is there, the still and solemn power of many sights and many sounds and much of life and death. In the calm darkness of the moonless nights, in the lone glare of day, the snows descend upon that mountain. None behold them there, nor when the flakes burn in the sinking sun, or the star beams dart through them. Winds contend silently there, and heap the snow with breath rapid and strong, but silently. Its home the voiceless lightning in these solitudes keeps innocently, and like vapor broods over the snow. The secret strength of things which governs thought and to the infinite dome of heaven is as a law inhabits thee. And what wert thou? And earth and stars and sea, if to the human mind's imaginings silence and solitude were vacancy.
Professor Moynihan, thank you very much for the presentation. And although you must be exhausted, I would like to ask you a couple of questions and maybe make a commentary. And I want to start with Pay the Piper and maybe a commentary on Enlightenment and counter-Enlightenment, and here Romanticism and non-Romanticism, beyond Romanticism. Shelley was obviously a very unhappy man with his time. But he obviously also received a very good education, which allowed him to actually protest against some of that education. If you were able to reproduce a better universe in which Shelley today would live happier, what would we be able to actually make different in a school so that somebody like Shelley could survive?
Well, you have to, Shelley detested school.
And so do a lot of students today.
Yes, he was, of course, he had trouble at Eton. He was always eccentric. At Oxford, he delighted in kind of a pre-Oscar Wilde show of clothing that was expensive and of the highest style. He and Hogg would go to the tailors together. They may have finally paid them, by the way, and would walk around the quadrangle at Oxford, and they were noted for their dress and for their eccentricity. And this is long remembered. One of the classmates became a very famous engineer, and he had very good memories about this. But what kind of education? Well, Shelley was wealthy, and Hogg's father was a very successful barrister. He himself became one. You didn't have to finish Oxford University to become a barrister. You went to a law office and read law, the way Lincoln did it, also in our country. But they traveled. It's amazing to me, reading the letters and the records of travel of these men, Byron included, how frequently they traveled and how many countries they traveled. So they knew foreign languages. They knew French, for example. They could get by in Italian. That's where Shelley's life ended at the age of 30, off the sea of in the Sea of Italy, off of Italy, in a major storm.
So they should travel, and when they travel,
well, they should travel. They should and learn a foreign language. And the paradox of American education, at all levels, private to state, is that people don't learn a foreign language, and there are not enough foreign language opportunities. Not in English-speaking countries, but in France and Italy. Tony Rota, before his death, 2 or 3 years ago, wanted an Italian institute. And of course that could have been prepared by lessons in Italian. The funny thing about foreign language study is that it has a hierarchy of snobism. French is probably at the pinnacle of this imaginary mountain, followed by German, followed then by Spanish. Very few universities or colleges offer good courses in Italian. Yet that is the primary language of the Renaissance. The Renaissance came in Italy in the 14th and was flourishing in the 15th centuries. Its great works by Dante were written in that period. Their poetry, their art, their music influenced all of European culture. And yet it's derogated because Italians came to America as laborers or as shopkeepers. But their cultural tradition is the richest of any culture of
Shelley
any nation. Yeah.
Shelley not only knew the tradition in which he grew up, he knew enough about it to reject it. So you don't actually have to accept the biblical tradition he stood in.
Well,
before I ask you about the
biblical tradition, yeah. The other thing that's interesting, I don't have time for every topical reference here, but they were set upon by spies. The Italian government at that time was controlled by tyrants, and they spied on them all the time. But they weren't English spies, and so they felt some relief from that. And then the weather was kinder. Shelley practically died in 1813-14 before he left and went to Italy on doctor's orders. He had abscesses on his lungs, and so it's remarkable. And then, of course, this fabulous poetic flowering at the age of 25. Simply astonishing, yeah.
He not only had traveled, but he had also actually taken courses, obviously, in other disciplines, which made it possible for him to write Mont Blanc. Mont Blanc, as a pantheistic poem, is able to draw on experiences within the natural sciences. Where did he get that training from?
Well, he got it from his reading, Buffon, B-U-F-F-O-N.
So do we need training in the natural sciences?
Oh, yes, absolutely, absolutely. One of my questions in my doctoral orals was what major poet was influenced by geology, and I said Shelley. Yeah. That was before I went to Yale, by the way. So it's, I think, to put this in some kind of perspective, the best learning is aided by colleges. The best learning is self-motivated. The best learning occurs in the library. Okay. The best learning is suggested by a reference in a work, and then you go read the reference. That leads then to other references. It's just the opposite, I think, of the expectation that I read in a book that.
Which would be passively receiving and not rendering receiving.
That's nonsense, okay. No account in a newspaper by itself has meaning. You have to compare it with other accounts that precede and follow that account, hoping thereby that you can get some grasp of the reality. Harry Truman very openly stated, you can't learn what's going on in the government by reading the newspaper. You can, though, if you follow events in several issues of the paper. See, that's the qualification I would put on that. And then also if you have some kind of generalized pattern about greatness of historical figures, chief in my estimate is our own Lincoln, then you have some basis by reading extensively in Lincoln, including his contradictions. Then you then have a basis for a comparison with other political leaders. Now,
we're not speaking in a social void.
Yeah, that's right. Most conversations, as you all know, take place on a very flat and narrow plane. All right. It's very rare that you find someone who's a real reader or has read, let's say, Margaret Macmillan's latest work on World War I, and that, of course, should be read. Her book on Europe, 1919, should be read. Margaret Macmillan, because she explains that we are really following the English and picking up their trash after that peace agreement of 1919 in the Mideast. Okay, so if anybody wants to understand the daily phenomena of news, it would be to find out how these people have been traduced, sold down the river, double-crossed, etc., etc., etc.
Which gets me to the Man of England, because it's actually a political engagement of an English poet who is afterwards applying and making relevant of what he's saying in form of a political protest, which is a political protest against a lot of things. One
Yes,
might still be relevant today. The people who cannot pay their tuition probably should read this poem because they would know against whom they have to protest.
And I would say that the whole process of American education of borrowing money and then going and spending 4 years in a playpen as semi-adults is a very bad and socially injurious practice. And yet that is, from my casual observation of many years, that is what's happened. Students should not have to borrow money to go to college. All right. We could build 1 or 2 fewer battleships. This is what Eisenhower said in his farewell address. And he explicitly cited the waste of money in the military and what it could be used for in peaceful pursuits, including, of course, education. It's simply inexcusable that parents and their children tolerate this abuse. It's outrageous.
And it's a prospect of human improvement, which you said in the last part of your presentation, that leads to some form of heightened experience and hopefully autonomous people who afterwards become members of a civil society in which they cannot just be people who pay the piper. I wanted to shift gears a little and get towards the question of atheism.
Yes.
Could you return to atheism and Shelley?
I was going to put a prefatory remark on that. I have, in my almost 40 years, encountered many people whose lives have been saved by religion. Okay.
Obviously not Shelley's.
No. Well, Shelley died at the age of 30. Okay.
He might have had a late conversion.
Robert Browning wrote the most perceptive introduction to a little collection of Shelley. And he said, by this time people are complaining about him, oh, he's an atheist, oh, he's a vegetarian, oh, he's a believer in free love, oh, he's this, he's that. He said, well, he's a young man. Young men do this kind of thing, you know.
Voltaire reverted, but only in the last 5 minutes of his life.
Yeah. No, Shelley was not converted when he went down off of the, as the British called it, Leghorn. What a corruption for Livorno, I think is the Italian name. The British called it Leghorn. But religion in his time was much more repressive than it is today. Okay, religion now does many, many good works. And religion as an introduction to literacy by reading the scriptures is invaluable.
Which means, Professor Moynihan,
it doesn't mean you have to believe it. Okay.
But you would still teach the Bible. We have here a literary background on the backbone of study of a book which you obviously didn't agree with.
Well, yes. Well, you can't agree with the whirlwind taking people up into heaven.
But you taught the Bible as literature, didn't you?
Yes, I did. Yes, and I
should one still study that?
My seminar at Yale was with a professor named Brisman, which has a certain irony, and it was a very, very interesting course. Unfortunately, 3/4 of the personnel in the class were preachers, were ministers, and they were rather stolid. And but it was an invaluable course, and it is the basis of the pattern, the paradigm of much of our literature. One does not, however, have to believe it. Okay, and that, of course, that great reform came about in the 19th century, I think, with Renan, wasn't it?
Ernest Renan.
Yeah, and the most interesting thing about that course at Yale was going through the biblical text, and you can tell when you're sensitized to this, you can tell the stitching between the phrases, and you can tell that they're not all written simultaneously as we now expect writers to do. These are collections. Okay, the Old Testament is a collection. And I also realized that the first book of Genesis is actually a quite late work. It has great sophistication. The concept of law and the attempt by Adam to blame Eve for his grievous error is quite sophisticated. It does not stand up in any court or any testimony, except of course one run by authoritarians. So I thought that was very interesting from that study of the Bible.
To return to Shelley,
Yeah.
his sister must have, well, Mary Shelley has a very different account of the journey, because coming back she wrote Frankenstein. When she wrote Frankenstein, was she inspired by a terrible journey with two men who didn't pay attention to her?
Yes, well, she had trouble with Shelley. Shelley had, like Leonard Bernstein, a roving eye, and for women, however. And she was displeased with that. She was displeased with the fact that he dragged her all over. She was much more passive than he was. She survived him by many years. She edited his works, and she smoothed the personality of Shelley. Okay, she removed the overt agnosticism, if not atheism. Shelley wrote some very, very strenuous pieces. For example, here's a little collection, and just imagine these titles. See if I can find it here. When Love is Sold, The Refutation of Deism, Refutation of the Christian Religion.
Must be a bestseller.
Yeah. He had almost no sales, by the way, during his life. Essay on Love, Essay on Life, Essay on a Future State, Essay on the Revival of Literature. Of course, the necessity of atheism is here. It's a very mild little tract, by the way. Essay on the Devil, and Fragments of Reform. Okay, these are not things that you would put out on your Victorian coffee table. And what Mary Shelley tried to do was to make him acceptable to the Victorian reader. And of course he became very, very popular after his death. And he greatly influenced Browning, he greatly influenced Tennyson. And to me, he's the most exciting romantic poet because of this aspect of his intellectuality. With Wordsworth, you get more of a passive appreciation of nature. Okay, the Wordsworthian voice of nature is not a great voice. It is extremely quiet, and for that reason, I had quite a bit of trouble admiring and loving Wordsworth. When I went to graduate school, started in 1960, one of the things that was expected is that you should love Wordsworth. No, I did not love Wordsworth.
To get away from the
Yes.
passive, can we get to the
Yes,
active
yes,
ending
yes.
of the poem? The
Yes,
poem
yes,
ends,
yes,
and what
yes.
were thou, and earth, and stars, and sea, if to
Yeah.
human minds imagining silence and solitude were vacancy? So, how would you interpret the ending?
Well, silence and solitude are not vacancy, okay, because those words could describe the memory.
That would be that memory discarded.
And that could be the scene which he's just described so brilliantly. If you, again, go back in a perspective and view the mountain, it appears to be stable. And just go test this yourself. Look at a hillside and then walk to the hillside and then start examining the hillside. All the life forms there, all the forms of death and renewing life, fallen branches, mushrooms, birds, whatever. You do not see those from a distance, and they appear to be silent. And so that's the paradox of perspective. That's the paradox of the delusion of the passivity of nature, and of course it's quite active. Go out and lie on the grass, and you'll see all kinds of animals and insects roving around out there. You don't see them when you're standing up, okay, but they're there, yeah, and you know they're there, all right, and they're not silent and they're not vacant. But there's another aspect of this psychologically. We can't be constantly aware of all things. In fact, our mind is designed to have forgetfulness. We can't every day recall the pains of our experience, the pains of death, for example. And we have a little kind of amnesia meter that allows us to go on with our lives. And it's silent, but those dead people still live in your memory.
Professor Moynihan, I thank you very much, and we ask you all now to go out and fill that vacancy, maybe see Mont Blanc or the world, and at least let the vacancy be filled. And I would appeal to you to, in order to do that, you could go out or you could go to the library and actually get physical books and read in those and see the world personally. Thank you very much, Professor Moynihan. Thank you for a great lecture.
Thanks so much.